but in part in consequence. I'll be within 1 second. Let me just finish this quick thought. Jews are delaying childbirth up to the point that infertility becomes an issue in many parts of the Jewish community. And so this is for women, for example. Jewish women under the age of 30, 70% have not yet had children, as compared to 44% in the American population generally. Jewish women under the age of 40, 36% have not had children, as compared to 20% in the American population generally. I'm sorry, please.
I only wanted to know if you had left out the single-parent families and divorce for a reason, because it seems to me those are relevant for women and children.
Absolutely. Only because there are limits to how much I was able to include, and the real topic we expect will emerge more in closer discussions of educational attainment. I'll be in 1 second, although I will say that in terms of American Jewish communal policy, firstly, one issue that has not been addressed is, in a systematic way, is the question of singles, which in part, in defense of American Jewish community, in part, it is unprecedented in American Jewish life that people voluntarily, and I use the term advisedly, but voluntarily choose to delay marriage up to their late 20s and 30s and beyond, that whole communities and populations of singles emerge. This is something that we just don't know much about in Jewish history. I don't know that there is any precedent for it. And to the extent that that does exist, Jewish communal policy has always been family-oriented. The synagogues are family-oriented. Usually membership in synagogue is a family unit rather than an individual unit. And we don't have much practice in responding to that issue. Single parents are in many ways an analogy to that same phenomenon, although we have had some experience with it. And I remember having this conversation with a group of rabbis in which I noted that lowest synagogue affiliation operates in single-parent homes, which are usually headed by females. And one rabbi raised his hand and he said, well, that's not really an issue in my community. We have no single mothers in my shul. I said, yes, that's exactly right. So it not only is it an issue, but it isn't even an issue in the minds of those for whom, and of course, that's one rabbi in one particular, experience. So your point is well taken, and I appreciate that. Gentleman over here, yes, in the back.
I read on the JPA's website, there's a denominational breakdown
Yes.
of these figures.
Yeah. I have purposefully avoided that, but I'll be happy to respond to it. I'd be happy to. The denominational breakdown overall suggests that the largest denomination today, and remember, domination by
the demographic, the childbearing,
Yes.
the age.
Yes, it is pointed very heavily in the direction of the smallest denomination, which is Orthodox, but growing nevertheless, no question. It's difficult to make the kinds of projections that some people have wanted to make, and that is that in 20 years there'll be nothing left but young Orthodox families, but there's no question that seems to be a trajectory that we have to be concerned with. My concern equally is that the fastest growing, I think I said before, the fastest growing of all of these streams is none of the above. People who have simply opted out of that kind of designation, or a variety of other kinds of interesting subtitles or headings that point in the same direction. Non-denominational, interdenominational, trans-denominational, post-denominational. It's interesting how creative we can become in saying that we don't want to belong, that we don't want to be part of this. And one more point on Table 5, which is something that we have known for many years, and that is that education also has an impact on number of children born. Although it by education level, yes. It's not quite what we have suspected in the past. There seems to be a closer relationship between Jewish women at different levels of education and the general population. But because Jewish women tend to be far better educated than women in the general population, we have watched very closely the impact of that variable on family size, on tendency to marry later, and also on family size. Let me take a breath now, and yes, please.
I read on the Jerusalem Post website this morning, purely by coincidence, an article about a new TV show that I think started in 2003 called OC.
Yes.
I hadn't heard of it until this morning. It's about a man called Cohen, and he's married a non-Jewish woman. I wonder what sort of impact, what the purpose of this is, and what impact it's having. And a subsidiary question. I think about 15 years ago, I read some research about mamzerim in America. This is where Jews marry in a kosher synagogue wedding, divorce civilly, remarry, and the children of that second marriage. And the projection 15 years ago that in about 10 years, and now it's more than 10 years, there would be at least 200,000 mamzerim. So I wonder if you could say something about that as well.
It's an interesting question as far as the first is concerned, and I must admit that media is not my area, of expertise. That Hollywood and mass media generally, but certainly Hollywood movies and TV have more readily come to terms with the large, disproportionate number of Jewish operatives at the highest levels in that industry, and are less shy than they were a generation ago to own up to ethnicity. But the ethnicity of the Jews in Hollywood today is very different than what their ethnicity may have been 30 or 40 years ago. And in many instances, it is a fair reflection of their own experience and values that they be intermarriage, and that intermarriage be more or less an acceptable phenomenon, and that it has been suggested broadly that American Jewish religious affiliation, and perhaps religious affiliation generally in the United States, is increasingly individualistic, some suggest even narcissistic. Look, if Madonna can study Kabbalah, if Versace can study Kabbalah, then we are in a very, very different phase today, both for Versace and also for Kabbalah. And that there are rabbis who are more than happy to officiate at these various activities. And even each of us sort of get a tickle out of reading about it in People magazine or whatever other media outlet. If you're asking, do I think that that has an impact in legitimating or in encouraging intermarriage, I think that intermarriage in the United States doesn't need that impact. And if anything, it's sort of a reflection. Does art is art a reflection of life, or is art really lead? I think in this case it's a reflection. Mr. Galbi, 1 second. Your second question about mamzerim, I know of no research that has been done, nor do I think it would be very easy to undertake that type of research. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's something that we would want to easily, I don't know if there would be funders for that type of research.
Don't ask, don't tell.
But that there is potential for that sort of phenomenon, I don't think there's any doubt about it, and I would be very, very hesitant to draw any projections about it.
A lot of ways that you don't do research on these things, let these things, let people go.
And there are also those who suggest that halacha might support the idea of doing no such research at all. The Talmud and Brachot suggests that blessings do not accrue to anything that is counted. And so, notwithstanding the fact that we are, the American Jewish community is probably the most counted of any ethnic community, and we do it ourselves, there are many sectors of the community that simply will not cooperate with these undertakings on religious grounds, among others. Question over here, and then we'll move ahead, please.
Yes. In 1956, the United States Census study showed that intermarriage among Jews was 7%.
Under 10%, correct.
In 1976, it was 37%.
Mm-hmm. So your first note is 57, if I'm not mistaken, which is the last time the United States Census was permitted to ask a question on religion.
In 56, it was the illegal question.
Yeah, it was
At
the
the time.
last time.
Right.
And the Canadians still ask a question of religion, and I might add, upon arrival at Ben Gurion Airport for the first time, I was asked to fill out an immigration form in which a question about religion appeared. Also, they asked for my grandfather's name, which was something that I've never been asked before. So apparently that's something either for purposes of research or whatever, we're here in Israel as well. And the estimate was under 10%, probably 7 or 8% in the 50s. I think I mentioned this earlier on. By the 1970 study, the number was about a third. So either the initial research was too low, which is also possible. The 7% may have been an underestimate. Or something happened radical, and then following in 1990, 20 years later, so that over a period of a generation or a generation and a half, intermarriage rates tripled, perhaps quadrupled. And that's something that certainly led to concern, no question.
In 1976, the Harvard study of population had optimistic and pessimistic figures on the Jewish community at 2076. The optimistic figure was 900,000. The pessimistic was 11,000.
Yeah, and this, I made reference to these kinds of projections earlier on.
Yeah.
Even Professor Schmelz, who is a very, very responsible demographer here at Hebrew University, made these kinds of very, very dire projections, which included projections for the year 2000, and we have exceeded those projections. We've done better, again, depending on how one defines who is Jewish and affiliation. Tables 8 and 9 take a look at variations in intermarriage rate more directly. And here again, you see the growth in Table 8 from something around 13% in the data that have been gathered here. In other words, people were asked, when did you get married? For those who answered that they were married before the year 1970, 13% were intermarried. For those who were married between 1985 and 1990, 43% were intermarried. For those married in the 5 years most recent to this particular survey, 96 to 2001, 47%. And the 47% is probably the closest analogy to the pardon me, to the 52% that had been projected in the 1990s survey. We are now just about, let me just finish the thought, we are now just about entering, well, in the United States, after Labor Day, beginning of September, already begins the holiday season. It used to be only the month of December, but now, for good commercial reasons, the holiday season in my country has been expanded to about 4 months. Certainly Thanksgiving today, after all, we are in the heat of the holiday season, and sociologists of the Jewish community have talked a good deal about the December dilemma, conflict. The December dilemma is directly an outgrowth of this question of intermarriage. What do intermarried families do in the month of December? Most especially since, because Hanukkah had the good fortune to fall approximately the same time as Christmas, not this year, and so many people will be having their Hanukkah celebrations at the end of the month, even though Hanukkah is the first or second week of December. What do intermarried families, and particularly intermarried families with young children, do in this December dilemma? Do you have no religious articles or holiday celebrations in the home, neither a tree nor a menorah? Do you have both, what we call a menorah, what more correctly you call a Chanukiah? Should you have that as well as a tree? Do we have ham with Aunt Elizabeth and then latkes with Tante Yetta? Exactly what are our practices? Do we become all-inclusive and allow for every possible permutation, or do we become neutral and therefore, what's the word I'm looking for, spare, impotent, and have no celebration at all? And in fine American fashion, Yankee ingenuity, the Hallmark Company has marketed a series of holiday cards for families of mixed heritage of this type. Which again are either so neutral and bland about one's holiday celebrations as to be inoffensive to anybody or offensive to everybody, or to include all the various types, and we now have an African American celebration at this time called Kwanzaa, which yet adds to the confusion. In any event, it's an indication that this has become a very real phenomenon in American life, and that there is a commercial response to it. And you can see the projections that emerge from those who were married at the earliest level to those who were married at most recently. And then the second table gives us a couple of important independent variables or associational variables. I want to call your attention to two of them in particular, well, as long as we're looking. Certainly age, those who are younger are more likely to intermarry than those who are older, not a surprise. Gender, the differences between men and women are much smaller than they were in the past. for a host of reasons, and we have all sorts of data that, not just within the Jewish community, broadly indicate that women tend to be more religious by a variety of different definitions than men, and that also because women tended to be more sheltered in American Jewish homes than were their brothers. And also because women were less likely to be in the workforce, less likely to be on college campuses than their brothers. For a long time, we made a reasonable assumption that intermarriage would be much, and it was borne out, would be much more prevalent among men. Today, that is no longer the case. It is still more prevalent among men, but only slightly so. And that is, again, a function of the fact that women are, how shall I say, that intermarriage is much more equitable and an equal opportunity employer available, not, how shall I say, not discriminating by gender. Not surprisingly, I'm skipping over to Jewish education. Those with the least Jewish education are much more likely to marry out of the faith. Those with day school education are very, very unlikely to marry out of the faith. And we're talking about day school of any type and any variety, whether up to age 7, whether up to grade 7, whether through high school, of any denominational affiliation, although the overwhelming majority of day schools in the United States are either Orthodox affiliated or community day schools, usually under Orthodox direction. The one that I want to note with you is education. Take a look at that for a moment, because in some ways it is counterintuitive, at least to the wisdom that we had, the revealed wisdom, as it were, the wisdom that has been handed down over the last couple of generations.
Well, because there are more Jews at the university.
Very good, sir. And that was never, not only that there were more Jews at the university, but there was more Jewish life at university than there ever was before. The wisdom that I grew up with, the conventional wisdom that I grew up with, and that became very much part of the rhetoric and the ideology of Jewish organizations everywhere, was that if you sent your son or daughter to a university campus, of course not Yeshiva University, but to a university campus, you were just about signing the death writ to their continued Jewish affiliation and or marriage in the faith. That university life was the great demon. And
Disaster area.
pardon me?
Disaster area.
It was a disaster,
That's what
absolutely.
Keith Greenberg told.
Absolutely. Today, what we're finding, at least these data suggest, and I want to be very cautious about these interpretations, one set of data do not a theory make, but that these data suggest that people who have lesser education, high school or below, are more likely to intermarry, and that the higher one goes in formal education, I'm not talking about Jewish education now, that's a separate table, the higher one goes in formal general education, the less likely is their intermarriage, and that raises a couple of important points. One, which you correctly note, and that is the increasing numbers of Jews on university campuses in the United States that were Judenrein up until 15 years ago, perhaps 20 years ago, number one. Number two, the increase of Jewish life, organized activist Jewish life, and I have to certainly reflect the impact of my boss, my new boss, Richard Joel, his prior incarnation as director of the Hillel Foundation, certainly made a profound contribution to organized Jewish life, allowing kids who might otherwise be lacking any form or any access to identification in university campuses that had never that kind of impact before. It also raises another set of questions, and that is what happens with those who do not go off to campus. In other words, what we're saying here is that the American Jewish community is so professionalized and so upwardly mobile, and you can take a look at that very quickly, although I don't want to spend too much time with it, in talking, in taking a look at, I'm sorry, the previous couple of tables, 6 and 7, which talk about education, employment, and income, which tell us, for example, that 25% of Jews have a graduate or professional degree, only 6% of the general American population. The Jews are some 4 or 5 times more likely to have a university, an advanced university degree, and that means that those young people who do not go off to campus are more likely now to mix in non-Jewish circles, more likely now to be choosing their mate, or in a more cynical way, not being good marriage prospect for other members of the Jewish community. That is to say that in the resume of the typical young man or young woman, a graduate or certainly a college education is a given, and if it is not, does not appear on the resume, then that person is no longer a reasonable prospect which may not be the case in the general American population, and therefore propinquity, simply the contact and the opportunity for interaction, now operates at the lower level of education as opposed to where it operated before at the higher level of education. That's a very, very profound and important difference.
Or maybe when Jews marry each other, they go to graduate school.
They go to graduate school together. Or they go to graduate school and then meet instructors who are Jewish in unusual places. Places, again, that have not been known for, that were never called Yiddish Gegend, that have not been known for intensity of Jewish practice and commitment. Yes, sir, please.
Now in the world of Aguda and to the right, going to college is a minus.
Yes, and my guess is that that's not well reflected in these data.
I don't even know if they were included properly in the data of the people that were solicited and that they participated. I don't know.
There's no question that represents an undercount, and by the way, there's no question in general, and the people who undertake the survey, certainly the 1990 survey, formally and less formally in this survey, owned up to the fact, A, that they did make some very serious attempts to reach into the more parochial elements of the community in order to include them. They have, and I take a certain responsibility sitting on the board of those who generated the questionnaire. And also that there are certain portions of the community that are very difficult to reach. By the way, at the opposite end of the spectrum, it used to be much easier to reach the more liberal elements of the Jewish community, to the extent that many parts of the Jewish community at the more liberal end are unaffiliated, therefore more difficult to include in the typical network. That end of the community, that end of the community is probably undercounted as well in many facets. Shmuel, please.
The two factors or variables I think that do not show up here, which we must take into account, and I don't even know how to research them. One of them is, the phenomenon of, we said about 57% were intermarried, not only because Jews didn't want to marry outside, but also how society, was the Gentile society ready to accept them? You all remember, wasn't it Gentleman's Agreement, the movie?
Yes.
1947.
Yes.
Gregory Peck, which was the norm. On the other hand, in addition to that, we must take into account that today to be Jewish is not as outcast or as it was in the 40s and the 50s. However, there's also an attraction for those who are not Jewish to marry into Jewish and become Jewish, because it's a question of status, because of the what you showed here about income. I mean, today, to be Jewish in America means you become a part of an elite. It's not something that as a result, I think the numbers are not going to be as bad. If you're looking for a reason why they're not as bad as the demographers told us, it's also because to be Jewish is not anymore as downgrading as it was years ago.
If I were to be purely objective, I would say that there is reason to celebrate in these precise data, because it is an indication to the extent that Americanization was one of the goals of the grandparents and great-grandparents who arrived on the shores of the eastern seaboard during the turn of the last century. And there's no question that Americanization in all of its facets was one of the intentions and one of the goals of that immigrant generation and their children. Then there's great indication here that that's been an enormous success, that American society broadly has opened its arms. Not just in terms of whether or not there's strictures in university campuses or medical schools, but in the most intimate types of demographic phenomenon, Jews are well accepted and are not restricted, no question.
So the question is now, maybe we are reaching to a point that we are not going to, the numbers are going to stop. In other words, we're not going to continue the trend that you said in the beginning, that it's going to double every 10 or 20 years. We're reaching a certain point, a certain level, which from now on, maybe will stay the 40, 50%, not go up to 60 or 80 as the trend would anticipate.
Polarization. Polarization.
Most financial institutions in their advertising and commerce say that prior performance is not necessarily an indication of future practice. That means be careful when you invest. Here too, investing in a projection that necessarily has to continue. It also raises some important questions, and I want to talk about education now, which is really my intent.
Question from Dr. Falk.
Please, before I go on, I'm sorry.
But the thing is, I'm not sure whether we're already in the formal question period, but I have
Please.
a fundamental question really, and that is, because you were expressing an optimistic view of the never-dying Jewish people, you were showing that we're more than 5 million in spite of all the dire projections and so on. But the thing is, the questionnaire was phrased in a particular way. There are some questions which, to my mind, were not asked, and had they been asked, perhaps you would have been given another dimension of this. And for example, I'll give you three examples of questions that were not asked, as far as I could understand, and it could have been asked. One is, what does being Jewish mean to you? In other words, is it a matter of religion, nationality, culture, identity, history, or something else? It's one kind of question.
It was asked.
No, just one.
Yes, it doesn't appear in these data. but it wasn't.
It was
Second,
Please,
I'm saying this
please,
because
please.
I think these questions are really important and may be perhaps not less important than the numbers of Jews as you have, and there are different demographic aspects as you have put them forward. The second question is, how important is being Jewish to you? And that is on a scale of 1 to 10, for example, because in Israel, for example, it is very important for us to be Jewish, whereas in the U.S. it may be much less important for Jews than many other aspects of their lives and identity. And the third question is being Jewish, more or less important to you than being American? Now, these are fundamental questions, and had you asked them, perhaps you would have come up with some perhaps less optimistic view of the never-dying Jewish people.
First of all, your points are all very well taken and very much on target. These questions, or questions similar to them, or I should say these questions and questions similar to them, were part of the package that looked at religious attitudes and social attitudes and so forth. I did not reproduce them here. I must admit I haven't looked at them as carefully as I have looked at some of these others. You're raising a question not so much about the numbers, the quantity, but much more so about the quality of Jewish affiliation, the nature of Jewish affiliation. I'll give you one example which takes us into a slightly different direction that I'll be covering at a lecture on Tuesday at the Political Science Department at Bar Ilan, in which Jews were asked about their support for an affiliation with the State of Israel. How many times have you visited? Do you have friends and family there? Those kinds of questions, as well as what do you think about Israel? And this was analogous also to the sets of questions about what does being Jewish mean to you? Do you believe in God? And so forth. And there, what we found was that across the board, Jews, even with the least affiliation, even those who had never visited and had no other connection to the State of Israel, a majority suggested that Israel is the spiritual center of Jewish life. And even among those who had almost no other connections, that there are dimensions of that affiliation that are usually sort of ignored, or certainly not included in the discussions are political, the discussions are social, the discussions are economic. Rarely are they taken within a spiritual vein. That also may feed in, and there too, discussions of Jewish affiliation in the United States in particular, tended to much more so toward personalism, tended much more so toward individual association as opposed to large communal, large social, large political activism and affiliation. And that reinforces the general assessment that religious life broadly, and that Jewish religious life in particular, is increasingly narcissistic, increasingly individual. People who are not